Thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I feel, in Ireland, they say, you're very welcome as a greeting, and I feel very welcome here. So thank you. It's really my honor and privilege to be here. As Michael mentioned, one of the things that he thought would be interesting is for me to talk about self-reliant leadership in the context of what you believe in terms of self-reliance. So, you know, I did write this book, and I'll talk a little bit about it, but what I think is always most interesting when I meet an author is why did they write their book, not what did they write about. So I'll take you back about 4 years. My son was a plebe, a freshman at West Point, and he was home on leave, and we were on a bike ride. And I had started this academic book on leadership, and we're riding, and he had been in the Army about 6 months, so he'd had a little bit of adversity himself, and he kind of knew what was all involved. And just out of the blue, he said, "Dad, why did you ever think you could make it through Special Forces? You were little, you were partying in high school, you weren't focused," and he rattled off 10 other things I probably don't want to share, of all the reasons I shouldn't have made it. And I thought, maybe I really shouldn't write an academic book. Maybe I should really write a book about my stories. Maybe what I can share with people about overcoming adversity and finding mentors and hearing the unheard can help people. So I'm an adjunct faculty at the University of Colorado for graduate students. I teach leadership and entrepreneurship there. I take students to Ireland each summer. I teach Doctor of Nursing practice and MBA students. And so a lot of what I put together are things that I've taught my students, but most of what I teach isn't from books. It's really from things that I've learned and people I've learned from. And so I think what I believe is from everyday experiences that we can learn a lot about self-reliance and we can learn a lot about leadership. And what's interesting is the nurses that I teach all wonder why they're required to take my class for the first 8 weeks. The second 8 weeks, they got it figured out. But the first 8 weeks, they say, "I'm a nurse, why am I taking leadership?" And what they realize is the first 8 weeks, it's really about self-awareness and self-discovery. And what do they, and it doesn't mean they're going to lead 100 people, but we're all leaders in different ways. We all need help of others, and we enlist the help of others to help us fulfill different things that we have, whether it be a grand vision or a small task. So, and that's really why I wrote this book, and it's called The Littlest Green Beret. And I'm not sure I was the littlest, but I'm pretty sure I was. I'll kind of tell you my story, and hopefully everything will work technology-wise. So in the context of leadership, I really want to talk about 3 things. One is crucibles, adversity, overcoming obstacles. The other one is mentors, and the last one is hearing the unheard. So regarding crucibles, I'll tell you a little bit about my story. So when I was 17, just like my son said, I was little. A senior in high school, and I had a chair to play drums, percussion, at the University of Florida. Came home very proud, told my parents I got a chair at the university. My parents said, "Great, scholarship?" "No, we have no money." I didn't know that. I thought I was always going to college. So my options were really community college and living at home, and then the Army. This is 1978. Nobody went in the Army in 1978. It was post-Vietnam. Nobody thanked people for their service. It was a bad place. So when I showed up at the recruiting office and scored real high, the recruiters felt like they found gold because they thought, this guy, we can place him anywhere. So I told them I wanted to be a drummer in the Army band. So my first plane ride, they flew me up to Atlanta, and I tried out, and on the way back I had this epiphany. The only epiphany I think I've ever had in my life. But I had this epiphany that I was good because I practiced, but I wasn't talented. And so I got off the plane, and the recruiter was there like this, and he said, "You ready?" And I said, "I'm not doing it." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I want to be in the Army, I just don't want to be in the Army band." And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to jump out of planes, and I want to go through the hardest medic program there is, because medicine always interested me." And he said, "Well, you should go in Special Forces." And I said, "I don't want to be a military police officer." And he said, no, 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 Special Forces is not the MPs. Special Forces is the Green Berets. And he handed me a brochure with a guy rowing a boat, camouflage, biceps like this. And I said, I can't do that. And he looked at me. His name was Kyle Fleener from Tennessee. And he said, yes, you can. I weighed 101 pounds. I was a senior in high school, and they told me I couldn't join until I weighed at least 103 and got a waiver from a doctor. So I drank milkshakes and lift weights, and I weighed 109. So January of my senior year, I enlisted. And then the day I went in the Army, I weighed 114. So I was big, massive. But you know, so I had a recruiter telling me I could do it. I had my dad who bet me $10,000 I would fail. I had a sister who said, what are you going to do when you fail? And then I'll tell you about somebody else that told me I could do it too. So I had, you know, just like all of us, we have lots of things all the time that people tell you you can't do, and then there's people rooting for you. And you got to listen to the people rooting for you. And just like all of us are going through stuff today, you know, we all are. Everybody's got their own obstacles and crucibles. But when I was 17 at the time, I didn't even know what a crucible was, an obstacle. I had never been tested. I mean, I had no adversity, unless you count getting chased by dogs on a paper route. I mean, that was about it. But I went in, and you know, I was in basic training, and we were sitting down one day, and this drill sergeant walked up and said, who here is going Special Forces? I raised my hand. I was the only one. And he said, you're not going to make it. The rucksacks, the backpacks, will weigh more than you. You're going to fail. And I thought, oh my God, there's somebody else telling me I'm not going to make it. Somebody that's been in the Army a long time. I mean, what did I do listening to Kyle Fleener? What did he get me into? But I hung in there, and you know, everything I did, I kept thinking about, you know, the people that said I could make it. And what motivated me even more was I didn't want to give my dad the satisfaction of, you know, winning the bet, and I didn't want, you know, I didn't want my sister to have been right. And so the whole time I kept thinking, I kept visualizing putting on that beret in a ceremony that would be 18 months later, because I thought that's going to be a proud moment. So all the times that I wanted to quit, and trust me, there was a ton of them. Because, I mean, you know, when you just are exhausted and you just feel like laying down and crying, I just thought, I'm going to put that thing on my head. Because the other thing is, if I fail or if I quit, I'm going to go to Korea. And I know it's cold there. And I didn't want to go to Korea. But I made it through, and I got selected to be an instructor for the Special Forces School out at the camp. And so I was in charge of 500 students that went through this high-risk training, and I was the medic for them, and I was an instructor. And when somebody quit or failed, there's a song by Queen called Another One Bites the Dust. You guys heard it before? Another One Bites the Dust? Well, they would play that over the loudspeakers. And the people that quit would sit dejected, waiting for the trucks to come 50 miles away and get them and take them back. And one day, I was walking by the students who had quit, and that Queen music's playing over the loudspeaker, Another One Bites the Dust. And who's sitting there? That drill sergeant that told me I wouldn't make it. And I walked up to him, and maybe I was up to 120 at this point. And I said, Sergeant, do you remember me? And he just looked up and said no. And a proud moment in my life, there's a lot of unproud moments, but a proud moment, I didn't say anything. I just walked away because I knew, you know, I knew in a way I had a little victory, and that I'd won, and that, you know, just because, you know, somebody said you can't do it, I mean, doesn't mean that they're right. And this guy, and anybody that, and what I realized through all of that was, if you want something bad enough, you can achieve it. Because my son was right, really. I mean, there's no reason I should have made it through. I mean, you've seen the average Green Beret, right? I mean, you, in your mind, in the movies, they're all big. Well, most of them are pretty lanky, and what they are is they're just tough, and they know how to suffer. They really know how to persevere. And there's a certain amount of self-reliance in them, because that self-reliance is really self-talk. Because everybody that goes through that kind of stuff wants to quit. There's nobody that sits there and says, I like being cold, wet, tired, and hungry. I mean, like all the time. It's miserable. So that's really what I learned about crucibles. And I'm not sure if you can tell which one's me in the picture. But this was the ceremony right before I got my beret, the thing that I had been waiting for all those times, because we got to take off the baseball hat and put on the beret. And that's the picture that's on the cover of my book. And I remembered a long time ago that I thought maybe I'll write a book and maybe I'll put that on the cover one day. And that's what we did. And I'm standing like this because it's November, and they wouldn't let us wear jackets because we were tough and we were freezing. Where was I stationed? That was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And that's by a pretty famous statue right up there called Bronze Bruce. That's its nickname. And it's this really great guy standing like this, and one foot's on a rock, and under the rock is a snake. And then he's holding a rifle. And I guess they've moved it around a couple times. But it's all the people that go through Special Forces, part of their ceremony is always in front of Bronze Bruce. So yeah, you can see the pine trees of North Carolina. And a couple more photos. This is called Australian rappel, when you go face first, and the whole idea is so that you're going this way so you can shoot your weapon while you're going down, which is a bunch of hooey, because you can't do that. I mean, nobody could do that. And my son has since told me that, Dad, this is banned in the Army because it's dangerous. So, and I didn't even have a helmet on, you know, a hat and my beret. And this was one of the A teams I went to Germany with, and I'm right there in the front, and you can see most of the guys are pretty big guys, and most of them could grow really cool mustaches, which I couldn't grow. And you know, the interesting thing about Special Forces is, you know, you'll hear a lot about it, especially now that there's this movie out, Active Valor, with real Navy SEALs and all that. The main thing is most of these guys are really quiet, very humble. What's a little bit scary is they're very smart, questionable morals sometimes. Questionable. Because their mentality is get the mission done. You know, no matter what, get the mission done. So it was an interesting place to start to study leadership, you know, about how come some people do the right thing and some people do the wrong thing. And regardless of rank, how come some people have more power and influence than others, even if somebody has lesser rank? So as a kid, I started paying attention to this, thinking, you know, why is that? And what's going on with that? But this is really, to my son's point, what I really learned through all that training at the beginning was that if you know how to suffer everything, you can dare anything. And I mean, that's really what I learned. That was the big takeaway, was you know, you don't need to set your sights low. And I continually remind myself of that to this day. Am I pushing myself as hard as I can and doing everything that I can to make a positive difference in this world? Because as somebody reminded me recently, I think it was a meeting I was at with Michael, you know, the one thing that we're all spending every day and bartering with is our time, which is a non-renewable resource. And what are we doing with that? So that's really the first part. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, I started realizing that there were these things called mentors. And you know, what's interesting that I learned from my students is I've had a lot of students say, I've never had a mentor. But what I started realizing was, well, maybe there's something to that maybe there's people that attract mentors more than other people, or maybe that reach out to them. So when I came up with this concept in my head of self-reliant leadership, it didn't mean that you go it alone. It really meant that you're asking yourself tough questions, and you're having the courage to answer them and act. And sometimes you need somebody else to help you with those questions. Sometimes we know what the questions are, but we need somebody to dig them out of us. I mean, as you know, your pastor, your coaches, counselors, anybody that you've worked with is really, in a way, holding up a mirror to you in a different way that lets you see things you otherwise wouldn't see. And that's what I learned from mentors. So let me tell you about a couple that were really influential. And the picture looks old because it is. This is a guy, and now you got to remember the Army is mostly, and to this day, is mostly Southern. You know, if it weren't for Texas and the South, I mean, I don't know if we would have an Army, as you all probably know. Special Forces, when I was in, was mostly New England guys, tough New England guys, and Southern guys. Hardly anybody from the West, hardly anybody from what we'd call the Northeast or even the Midwest. This is a fellow named Ola Mize. It's a pretty Southern name, Ola Mize. He's still alive. He was a Medal of Honor winner in Korea. And when I got my beret, he was the fellow that signed the certificate. He was a colonel. He was in charge of all special forces. And he was also the camp commander. So he would come into our aid station all the time, and he'd go, what you doing, peanut? That's what he called me, peanut. And here's this tough guy, and he was always in the aid station looking for Kerry lotion, hand lotion, and a Medal of Honor winner. And what was amazing was what he got the Medal of Honor for. I'll touch on a few things, and I hope it doesn't bother you too much. But you know, you don't get a Medal of Honor for not doing some pretty brave things. And what he did was his unit had gotten overrun. They were out of ammo, and the Chinese overran them in Korea. And he basically killed 13 Chinese and Koreans with a little tiny shovel by himself, hand to hand. Now this guy was maybe this much taller than me. I mean, a little scrappy guy. And I realized that everybody had immense respect for him based on what he had done in the past. That he had power and influence because of something he did. He just had this way about him, this reputation. And again, he was a colonel. He had high rank, so people paid attention. And I thought it was interesting that, you know, in a lot of ways he led by example. Has anyone in here ever heard of Colonel Nick Rowe? So this is a fellow that was in the Vietnam War. You probably saw him on the news if you were around in the 60s, because he was a prisoner for 5 years. He was the only fellow that escaped from the Viet Cong, not the North Vietnamese. And he came back, and he was one of the few fellows that was pro-war during the Vietnam War. So he was used by the Republican Party sort of as a propaganda, actually ran for office in Texas, lost, and then he came back in the Army, and he was the guest speaker at my Green Beret graduation. And then he was one of my bosses. He came back in to create what's called the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, teaching people how to handle themselves if they're prisoners or if they're in survival situations. He actually asked me to stay in the Army when I was getting out to go to college to help him run the school, and I turned him down. But what I thought was amazing about him was he was an intellectual. You know, I told you that some of the people in Special Forces had questionable morals. Not this guy. This guy was a West Pointer, and he was straight as an arrow. And you know what? You know, most people would consider him a hero. In Special Forces, a lot of the people at the camp, the soldiers that had been to Vietnam, didn't like him. They didn't respect him. They didn't think he was macho. You know, they couldn't relate to him. And I thought that it was curious. Here's a guy that's super smart, has accomplished a ton in his life, and not everybody is really on board with him. And so I started to think, well, you know, again, what makes people tick? Now, the sad thing is, he survived 5 years in a Viet Cong prison. He came back. He did some great things to train our soldiers. And then he was on a mission in the Philippines working on the counterinsurgency there, and he was assassinated. He had left some, you know, young kids, and it was very sad. So his tombstone at Arlington reads, Colonel, U.S. Army, United States Military Academy, 1960, POW in Vietnam from 63 to 68, born in 35, murdered by terrorists in Manila in 1989. What's most interesting is the back of his tombstone says this: "So look up ahead at times to come. Despair is not for us. We have a world and more to see while this remains behind." He wrote that as a prisoner in 1964, and they put it on the back of his tombstone. So I felt very fortunate to have, Ola Mize is somebody that I got to really study up close as an 18, 19-year-old kid, along with Colonel Rowe. And then one of the most interesting guys was this fellow. And how many of you have heard of Robert Howard before? How many of you have heard of Audie Murphy from World War II? It's sad. Bob Howard died about 2 years ago. He's buried at Arlington. He was one of the most remarkable bosses I ever had. He talked about digging shrapnel out of him. He'd come in the aid station all the time and go, "Sergeant Rutherford," and we'd dig stuff out. We'd be on runs, and he was an old man then. He was 42. And we'd go on runs, and he would literally be exhausted because he was trying to keep up with, 20-year-olds. And I would start IVs on him, and he would cuss at me and yell at me and order me not to do it. And I said, "Sir, you're in bad shape. I've got to do this." But his grit and his fortitude were unmatched. I mean, and I didn't know half of this when I worked with him. I knew he was a Medal of Honor winner, but he was the most humble guy, and he also struck the fear of God in us. I'll tell you that. We were scared to death of him because he looked friendly and smiling there. I don't think I ever saw him smile. But he knew how to motivate soldiers. So, there's such a contrast between, Ola Mize and Nick Rowe and Bob Howard, and the fact that at such a young age I was exposed to these guys. Now, granted, they were all soldiers, but they all had basically the same rank, and they were coming at it from really different angles. And I started to think, well, what makes them more effective? Ola Mize basically has a history. He leads by example. Colonel Rowe is an intellectual. He appeals to certain folks. Bob Howard's just a tough son of a gun. And again, he knew how to motivate people, and he could talk to them, and he could tell you could do anything. I mean, I am sure that if I had gone into battle with him and he told me to take a machine gun nest, I mean, I would have done it and thought I could, because he just instilled that in you. Talk about what a small world it is. One of the guys, when I was in college, I recruited, not on purpose, but 3 of my buddies went into ROTC, and they went in the Army. And then I went back in after college and became an officer. And one of my buddies was in Iraq about 3 years ago in Baghdad, operating as a camp mayor. And I get an email from him, and the subject line says, "Me with Medal of Honor winner." And the picture is him and Colonel Howard with his armor. And I thought, Colonel Howard would have never touched me like that when I worked with him. So he got soft in his old age. Anyway, I wish I had finished my book, before he died, and he could have said what was written. But when he died, there was such a tribute online that was unbelievable. There's actually unprecedented. There's a movement in Congress to get him an additional Medal of Honor, which has never been done. And there's some talk I've heard that Hollywood wants to make a movie of him so that people know about this guy. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. And if I was in it, it'd just show me him yelling at me for about 3 seconds. So, one of my favorite mentors is this fella. This is my wedding in 1984. George Callahan. I told you there was 2 people that told me I could do it. George was one of them. When I was 17 and as a senior in high school, getting ready to go in the Army, I worked in a meat department of a grocery store, cleaning it up at night. It was a nasty job. And one day, this fellow, who was a neighbor, who I really didn't talk to much, came up the counter, and I said, "Mr. Callahan, I'm joining the Army. I know you were an admiral in the Navy, but I'm joining the Army." And he just about chewed my head off. And he said, "I was a soldier in Special Forces. I was not in the Navy." And we became fast friends. And I would go to his house and he would show me all the memorabilia, because this fellow had been in World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And he didn't even go through airborne or special forces training until he was 40 years old. I mean, remarkable. And the most kind, gentle person in the world. George, I'm happy to say, is still alive. We saw him a week ago in Las Vegas. And hopefully this thing will cooperate, and I'll show you a few minutes of what we talked about. But this is me holding the beret that was awarded to me, and this is the beret that George gave me. He only had one daughter, no sons, and he gave me one of his berets, which is a really big deal. And this is in 2008, during my son's high school graduation, and he told my son, I will be at West Point May 2012, and he's got plane tickets to be there. And hopefully we're going to be able to do something really special with the generals there and roll out the red carpet, because I'm sure there's not many World War II, Korea, Vietnam veterans left, you know, that are so sharp. And what's so remarkable about you can kind of see his personality in that. And he's the eternal optimist and always sees good in people. His wife was telling us the only time she ever saw him get angry was they were in Homestead, Florida after Hurricane Andrew, and somebody came in to try to steal something from their house, and he let them have it. Again, she heard stuff coming out of his mouth she'd never heard before. But that was it. And, but he, you know, he's just a wonderful person. And what's so funny is he told my son recently, Kevin, Trudy and I are going to have to stick around longer after you graduate, because you're going to need us more as a lieutenant than you did as a cadet. So they're going to stick around. And his dear wife is 85 years old. They've been married 63 years. She's a German war bride. So she has all kinds of great stories, some sad stories about being in Germany during the war. She was even in a labor camp because she wouldn't go to Hitler Youth. So they put, you know, Hitler's army put her in a labor camp. And she's the most patriotic woman you'd ever meet. And so in May, I've got to do a video interview with her too, because she's really feisty, and she'd be fun to hear. But George was a great influence on me as well. So, you know, and through all of this, you know, what a lot of these folks have said is, you know, no one can give you better advice than yourself. And these true great mentors never were really people that were giving advice as much as they were trying to help you see things you otherwise didn't in yourself and things that you could do. And George always said, you know, the funny thing is, I mentioned before about being cold, wet, tired, and hungry. George always said, take, you know, every day, day by day, and when it's bad, take it hour by hour, and when it's horrible, take it moment by moment. And that played in my head a lot of times when I was cold, wet, tired, and hungry. So, the other part I mentioned, the third part, was hearing the unheard. And I think, you know, I say this is the hardest crucible of all, because, you know, talking about leadership, somebody told me once, well, if you're going to talk about leadership, you're going to have to face your own hypocrisy. Because what I tried to say in my book was, I'm not an expert on leadership. I'm a student of leadership. I'm better than I used to be, not nearly what I want to be. And this fellow is the one that's taught me the most of everybody. And this is my son, Kevin. And this is him at jump school. Those are the towers at Fort Benning, Georgia, where you practice parachute jumping. And very faint, you can see some parachute wings right there. And I had pinned my wings on his chest almost 30 years to the month after I got mine. And it was one of the best days of my life, better than me getting my wings. But this kid, I mean, continues to teach me a lot. I mean, you know, he's focused and he's smart, and you know, he makes me a better person, and he's challenged me. And you know, again, there's a lot of times when he makes me remember, you know, you have to face your own hypocrisy. You know, I find myself giving him advice that I'm not following, and challenging him. And you know, and again, I don't know if the book would have gotten done, you know, without his prodding. Because the other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to dedicate it to his class, which it is. On the front page it says, dedicated to the West Point class of 2012, Ganairi and Borlat, which is Gaelic for, may the road rise up to meet you. So I feel very proud that I was able to get that done and give something back, because when I was in the military, I thought the people that came out of West Point were a bunch of silver spoon-fed kids, a bunch of spoiled. And what I learned is it's not an understatement to say these are some of the best that this country has to offer. And when you go there, there's 4,000 kids, men, women, and it's funny. I was talking to my son tonight, and he had a gala this weekend to celebrate less than 100 nights before he graduates. And I said, "Did you have a nice time with your date?" And he goes, "Well, no, not really." He goes, she doesn't get it. And I finally realized that we're really different than regular college kids. They're worried about, oh, I got to go get a job, and we already know what our job's going to be, and not necessarily safe, a safe job. So, I mentioned before, that self-reliant leadership to me is knowing which questions to ask yourself and having the courage to answer them and act. And again, maybe you can figure those out. Maybe you seek out friends or mentors or trusted advisors to help you. But a lot of helping others, I think, is knowing yourself and being able to get things done that's making a difference in the world, that's bigger than yourself. One of the things that was kind of odd about writing this book was, I don't have any combat stories. I was lucky. I was in the Army from 1979 to 1988. It was during the Reagan era, and the skirmishes we had were minor, and I never had to really get shot at. So one of the things that I thought was, I really can't use the Green Beret in my title if I'm not giving back to people that are sacrificing. So with the book, the proceeds are going to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation and the Green Beret Foundation. And one of the best things that's happened is I've met some wonderful people that have reached out to me, some Gold Star parents that have lost their kids, and people that are donating to those foundations to help, families and soldiers that are hurt or killed. And there's a lot of stuff happening every day that doesn't make the news. The sacrifices people are making. And, just like in our community, all of you are probably doing things that go unsung. But hopefully when you see those things, you'll pay notice and let people know you appreciate it.